got to start to think about, if we're trying to persuade people to do things, we mustn't cross the line to what's now known as propaganda. Propaganda is a rational, reasonable word to use, but has a nasty connotation because of the way in which the Nazis in Germany during the Second World War used it. So as professional communicators, it's important to us that we think about the ethics of doing what we do. When we try to persuade people to do something, are we doing it in an ethical way? So for Hallahan, it's persuasive communication as well as giving information. But it's discursive, which means that it changes as the debate goes on. It's relational communication about stakeholders, if you like, or in my terms, target publics. And it's about trying to achieve an organisation's mission. If you put that thought in the context of what I was saying about issues before, you can see how issues are important in the context of what Hallahan and colleagues were saying in that journal. Sandhu, who wrote another piece for that journal a couple of years later, is saying that it's multidisciplinary. So it's using all of those bits of Marcon's. But it's intentional stuff and it requires a purpose. Organisations need to be purposeful actors. They need to have a reason for doing it and they need to do their communication in a deliberate way. That's about, I don't wake up in the morning when I'm a professional practitioner and say, oh, we'll issue a media release about X today. We wouldn't do that because there has to be a purpose for doing it. In my country, a lot of politicians issue media releases, 4 or 5 media releases a day, and no one ever runs them. That's not purposeful communication. And going back to the point that some of the other people were saying in the slides before, this is about rational and deliberate decision making. We take a decision rationally to engage in strategic communication. The famous American public relations scholar, Jim Grunig, says that strategic communication is a bridging activity between an organisation and its publics. And Grunig argues that this should be standard procedure in organisations. It should be institutionalised. That's one of the only quotes of Jim Grunig's that I use quite liberally because I don't always agree with a lot of the stuff that Grunig talks about and his colleagues. So we're talking about an organisation's mission. We're talking about being multidisciplinary, about being rational and deliberate in what we do, about decision making, and I jumped the slide, but that's all right. Hallahan and his colleagues in that article went on further to say that it's purposeful use of communication by an organisation to fulfil its mission, to do all those things. It differs from integrated communication because it focuses on communication across all organisational endeavours, not just the marketing endeavour. It's the other things that are happening that the organisation needs to think about. So it's the strategic application of communication and, importantly, an activity in which an organisation works as a social actor. A social actor means that they are contributing to debates about issues that concern their organisation. The public sphere, Habermas's public sphere, if you like. If you've read Habermas, you'll know that Habermas talks about us being able to have a discourse in what he calls the public sphere, where we discuss issues. And so what Hallahan and company are saying is, well, here's a role for companies as well, if you like, government departments, not-for-profit agencies. So it's informational, persuasive, discursive and relational in the context of an organisation achieving its mission. Paul Argenti says that it has a long-term orientation. It's thinking beyond today's immediate market issues. Joab Cornelissen, who's another European, and who's concerned, who writes a lot about corporate communication. And if you've been studying public relations, you'll know that there are as many definitions about what public relations is as I've had hot breakfasts. And so sometimes it's called public affairs, sometimes it's called public relations, sometimes it's called corporate communication. Cornelissen argues that corporate communication is strategic communication because it's about advancing top-level strategic goals and objectives rather than in implementing day-to-day tactics. The press release, the ad, the display, the boss's speech, wherever he might be. Cornelissen also says that strategic communication is a management function. Some people I'll talk about shortly, Bark and Allen and more American scholars, say that organisations have to get engaged in this stuff whether their managers like it or not. Managers are pretty conservative people. Not very many managers are risk takers, really. The risk takers are probably the really successful ones. But if you do an MBA, anyone doing an MBA here? Good, I can move, I never go on MBAs. If you're doing an MBA, you're going to be trained to think in a certain way and act in a certain way. What these guys are saying is that managers who've done MBAs need to think more laterally. Need to think about what's happening in the space rather than what the MBA says I should do. And they say that this, Cornelissen says that strategic communication is a much more substantial management function when it goes beyond that functional tactics that we talked about before, when it responds to business needs and concerns, when it advances top-level strategic goals and objectives rather than implementing tactics. It also involves counselling senior management on how they should react to issues. And it means guiding and managing organisational reputation and relationships with key stakeholders. Now this is going again another step beyond the market, if you like. We're thinking about something here which is beyond the selling of products. Paul Argenti and his colleagues say that as practitioners, we need to focus on the long term, but we need to remember that there is a day-to-day tactical thing that we've got to do, but that our role is a long-term one. And we need to be thinking, but as senior practitioners, about how we're going to position our organisation over the long term. Zerfas and Huck argue that, Zerfas is a European scholar, he now edits the International Journal of Strategic Communication. They argued that this idea of strategic communication helps to prepare organisations for uncertain times. And that's a hint of what I'm talking about when I come to issues. An uncertain time is what issues are going to come down the track and smack us in the jaw that we need to deal with, create an uncertain period for us. And so strategic communication, strategic issues communication is one way of thinking about that. Argenti and his colleagues argued that there were three things that drive strategic communication decisions, or I say influence strategic communication decisions. One is regulatory factors. What is it in the organisation's environment, the regulations about how they can go about stuff, how they must make safe products, for example, what the tax regime is going to be. They're all regulatory type things. So that's something we need to worry about. That's something that influences our strategic thinking. That's not a tactical thing. That's not a marketing thing. The complexity of organisations. If you're a complexity theorist, you'll know that lots of things, we're all a system, and what happens in this bit of the system affects that part of the system, and so on. So complex organisations, the complexity of an organisation affects its ability to make decisions about how it goes about its strategic communication. And they say that several corporate crises over a number of years has damaged the credibility of business. You guys are all too young to remember it, but the last global financial crisis was actually generated by the failure of American banks to properly manage the way in which they lent money. And some of the big American banks actually went broke, went out of business as a result of that. And so the American banking industry has a bad reputation. That's the point Argenti's making there about restoring credibility to business. I've added in some points there basically under corporate social responsibility, that is organisations, organisations being good citizens, the need for them to be open and honest in their communication, managing relationships in that context of corporate social responsibility, and generally about being good corporate citizens. So to kind of summarise where I've been, you could look at strategic communication a bit like a brick wall. And so it ends up doing these things. It's multidisciplinary, it's purposeful, it looks at the long term, it's about social actors, companies getting involved in debates about issues, and it's top level communication, we need the bosses involved here, and it has strategic goals in the real sense of strategic goals. So let's think about this issue's communication business by going beyond the day-to-day market. Issues act on organisations a bit like the old science fiction description of a butterfly in Brazil flapping its wings, impacting the weather in Europe. When you think, I'm not a physicist, but physicists debunk this sci-fi theory, and I think, well, if a butterfly is flapping its wings in Brazil, surely there are airwaves that happen, and by the time I reach 10, those airwaves will make her feel cooler than she already feels. But the physicists, they shoot it down. But it's a nice theory, isn't it? This is the chaos theory thing. I don't know what happens in Thailand, by the way, whether a butterfly flapping its wings in South America is going to affect the weather in Thailand, but it probably would, because if it's going to work in Europe, it's going to affect the whole world, isn't it? But think about the butterfly in Brazil being an issue that we didn't deal with 5 years ago, has now come along and interrupted our weather, or the way in which our company's seen. Think about it in the context of the global financial crisis, where the American banks didn't think about the damage to their reputation if they continued with their dodgy, and they went out of business as a result. If they'd been dealing with proper issues identification, they would have thought, hey, if anything goes wrong here, like it did 10 years ago, our reputation's going to be damaged. How are we going to handle that in a communication sense? And that's a metaphor for what I'm talking about today. So strategic communication really is perhaps a public affairs specialisation of public relations. I'd say it's beyond that, but it's about public affairs because we're dealing with public policy issues. The things that happen outside an organisation that we need to be aware of if we're going to deal with them and keep our business working properly. So public affairs is essentially about organisations engaging as social actors, getting involved in debates, trying to influence the way in which those public policy things happen. Example of that is if you, in my country, under the previous government, there was a huge row, public policy row, about the introduction of a carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme. What's happened since a change of government, there no longer is a carbon tax because the current government fought the previous government on the side of the mining industry particularly, and so we got rid of the tax. But the mining industry jumped up and down and said, this is a terrible thing, we shouldn't have to pay it, and blah, blah, blah. Why weren't they thinking about this 5 years before, when they knew that climate change and all of that was coming down the track, and they would be asked to pay their share for the damage that they get involved in. That's what I mean about dealing with an issue strategically. Trying to analyse what might be in this case, a political party's policy that we might need to legitimately influence before it comes down and bites us. Chaos theory. Heath and Nye, who write a lot about issues management, in fact Robert Heath is one of the world's experts about strategic issues management. But in this paper they argued that public affairs is about how organisations manage themselves in troubled times, and how they manage and engage with their key stakeholders, and they use the term state seekers, that is people who want to be stakeholders in an organisation. So all this brings us to a point where we need to think about how are we going to work to generate all of this strategic thinking. And I think this is a way that we ought to do it. Batik van Ruler, another European scholar, says that, talking about whether professional practitioners and academics are either Venus or Mars, you know, men come from Mars, women come from Venus, all that sort of stuff. They say that there are Batik van Ruler says that there are 4 models by which, in her case, public relations people decide how they're going to do what they do. The first one up here is the competition model, in which we use research, predefined knowledge and rational intelligence to take decisions. But the person who takes those decisions are the expert, you and me as professional practitioners, and our clients. We decide on the basis of that stuff what we ought to do. The next model is a personality model, where an expert and a client together decide on the basis of fluid knowledge and how we feel about the situation. No research here. How we feel about the situation. The next model is a status model, where the expert decides what to do, but does it on the basis of their fluid knowledge and emotional intelligence. So, you know, a wet finger in the air to see which way the wind's blowing, that's what we'll do. And then there is the knowledge model, in which we go back to the use of research and an expert deciding what to do and how to do it on the basis of that research. And that, to me, is really the sandpit in which we should be playing. Our toys are in that sandpit, where we decide what to do on the basis of some reasonable, proper research to get engaged in. I want to talk now about connections between this non-market environment I've been talking about, this environment that companies, organisations face, which isn't directly related to what they do in their marketplace. And is it possible to make some connections there? Okay, what is the non-market environment? Bark and Allen, I mentioned those people before, said that the non-market environment, and this is kind of a virtual environment, it's not a physical thing, although perhaps you could make a case that it is physical, but it's a virtual environment. It's the environment in which an organisation is concerned about its relationships beyond its markets, but relationships that may, down the track, I shouldn't have said that, that's an Australian phrase, in the future might impact on what we do in the market. This is a very specific place, a bit like Habermas's public sphere. But, say these guys, what happens in a non-market environment shapes the dynamics of what goes on in the markets. For example, if you're a widget manufacturer and you sell widgets and manufacture and sell widgets, you need to be aware of what your competitors are doing. You need to have good relationships with your customers, and you need to have good relationships with your suppliers. But what if you discover that from your research that demand for widgets is going to decline over the next 5 years. How are you going to communicate that to your customers? You're going to have to deal with it now in the non-market environment, because that demand for widgets is going to decline because there's a new, super, much more effective widget coming onto the market. So how are we going to adapt to that? So what this strategic thing is about in the non-market environment is being organisations being social and political actors to engage in debates to shape that market, because what happens in that external market has an impact on the market environment. Let me go back, I'll press the button too quickly. So here, this is a visual representation of these environments. The one right in the middle, the blue one, will be familiar to you. Here's an organisation in its marketplace concerned about its relationships with its suppliers, the people who give it the raw materials to make Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is interested in how Pepsi operate in their market environment. What are they doing? Should we do something about it? And of course, we're interested in our customers. We want to convince them to buy more Coca-Cola, drink more sugar. Right? The other market, the other virtual market, is the non-market environment, the one I've been talking about, in which citizens and governments and regulators and non-government organisations and even activists get engaged in discussions about things. And so in this context, we're not interested at the moment in the market environment. We're interested in what happens here, where issues emerge, where they're debated, and where sometimes politics happens. And as part of this environment,